One thing I've learned, if you don't hold their feet to the fire, everybody gets burned.
Hold on. Before you start waving around that freedom of speech thing, when you're in a crowded movie theater and you scream fire, you better be able to smell smoke. If you come on this radio show and you start saying incondescent things like that, you better have more behind you, pal, than just your thumb. I've been listening to talk radio for years, and one thing I just can't stand is when the host has to, push his way onto people, beat the callers into his way of thinking, extending his ego, or when the callers call in and say something so outrageous and the host lets it go unchallenged. The sign you're on the road to truth is the lack of contradiction. You want to find truth, you just don't simply believe somebody because of their authority or their degree, or you listen to what they say, you test it against reality, and you hold their feet to the fire. All right, we are back and we are live. It's Memorial Day weekend, Memorial Day in particular, at least the official holiday, Memorial Day. It used to be 30th, the end of the month, I should say, on May. But here we are, and we are live. I'd like to, we're going to do an interview with John Cole. He is a part owner and director of Sustainable Farm Development. And the recent shutdowns and interrupts in the government's reaction to the virus has highlighted the problems with the supply chain, but in particular the food supply chain. And in talking on the phone with John, JC for short, talking with him, it's a quite rich bio in dealing with this very issue, having gone through it in an earlier rendition through Western Europe with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the various countries, and they're dealing with the money and the trade and whatnot, being in charge of a lot of the liaison groups that with the Western or Eastern Europe countries and America as a Chamber of Commerce, etc. He has dealt with a lot of the problems, supply chains, collapsing currency, and so on. And so here we are in America going through our own version of it. And so he has put together a plan. He's been working on it for quite a while to take care of at least the food supply chain. He had, when talking, he quoted to me Kissinger, which said, "Control the oil and you control the countries." And he added, "Control the food and you control the people." And we could see that with this whole COVID thing, simply toilet paper going down, which always amazed me because toilet paper, what's that got to do with the flu? But nonetheless, it's only starting to now show up on the shelves regularly, as well as paper towel and disinfectants and whatnot are still gone, at least in my local stores. So the whole supply chain. Now the meat is coming down. The president had to step in and make it an essential type deal at national security because they were shutting that down. Going into the stores, you can see there's a supply of eggs, milk, and all that, but it's limited. It's not full all the time like it is. And there were times early on where there wasn't any. All this should be a big wake-up call to, hey, wait a minute. I'm living in Chicago area, which is like the middle of the Midwest where everything's supposed to grow. But in reality, a lot of the growth of the greens are now in California, and it takes a few thousand miles to get to their location. you close down that railroad or what have you, and you're in trouble. So what JC has is a nice outline of how to grow things in a more regional manner, and how to do that, because one of the problems with having regional farming is economics. It's cheaper to have these giant mega farms growing, like half the greens or more than 80% of the greens in California, but what happens when there's a problem in California? So we're going to go through that, plus other things, his experience over in the Eastern Europe aspects of currency and collapse and so on. So at this point, I'd like to welcome to Feet to the Fire, John Cole. And welcome, JC.
Well, thank you very much, James.
I appreciate you taking the time out and doing this, and all the work that you've done in here. It's quite interesting.
I believe it is, and I believe it's incredibly important for us in America and actually our world.
Now, you come in this with a pretty good background in what it takes to answer this question. It's not like you have one or two hats here, but you have quite depth in that in your experience in there. Perhaps you can go through some of that for us.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It it seems that my travel through this this time on on the earth, I came through interesting learnings. I was born in New York City, but I was raised in New Jersey, in a very nice area in New Jersey. And then I got educated in Pennsylvania at one of the top universities in the country in engineering. I got my civil engineering degree, which is these are the engineers that build society. We build the roads and we build the buildings, the waterways. And we also, what's not really focused on is that we look at how things collapse. I also had another degree in geology, and there again, we studied how things collapse, such as dams, such as earthquakes. And so with that combination, I have how to build things and how to identify things that could possibly collapse. So in the 90s, the early 90s, I was in real estate development in New Jersey. I got pretty bored. It was not exactly an exciting time to be in real estate. And I said, listen, I can go anywhere in the world and do what I wanted to. And I've traveled before. And I said, well, okay, let's go. And then right about November 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Of course, this took everybody by surprise. So I said, hey, what about going over to the former Soviet Union, of which I knew basically nothing about. I think most Americans have a very limited understanding of it. And I networked everybody I knew and ended up with the possibility of going into this country called Latvia, of which I didn't know anything about. Went over, looked, decided to go, and moved over just a couple of months after the Soviet Union collapsed, and ended up becoming the president of the first Western Chamber of Commerce in the country. Most people don't understand Latvia is a very tiny country, but it's significant in that its geopolitical location. It's the closest Western capital to Moscow. And of course, I didn't know any of this, but I got thrown right into the middle of it all as being the top spokesman for Western business. And in that, I had to, do my own business. A couple of things happened. Well, the first was we built the American Chamber of Commerce to be the most influential and the largest Western Chamber of Commerce in the country. And then from that, we ended up, let's say, advising, creating trust with the Latvians and the Latvian, the prime ministers and the cabinet ministers and advising them on law changes, transparently advising them on law changes. And I spent 18 years, almost 2 decades over there. And it turns out that Latvia is a very significant area because that was the focal point for the expansion of NATO and the European Union. I ended up becoming the building 2 embassies and 2 ambassadors' residence, and I was the landlord for the American ambassador and the European Union embassy. So I had a lot of contacts in a very tiny little pond, but very significant. And so one of the questions that ended up coming up was, why was the collapse of the Soviet Union peaceful? You know, you had 300 million people, 4 times the size of the United States, all of a sudden collapse in less than a week. How was it that it was peaceful? And, you know, I came to the part of the answer was that the first is they never had fear of not having food. Their supply chain collapsed, but most of their food was grown and produced within a 50-mile radius. And that the majority of things were so tough for the Soviet people during the 70s and 80s. And this was all my learning experience. I didn't find this out in America. I found that out over seas and, you know, with boots on the ground. And that the majority of the Soviet people had something called a dacha, which, you know, we don't have an exact translation for, but it basically means like a victory garden where they were able to grow their own food, and they could grow up to 70% of their own food for the year. So when the Soviet system collapsed, all of a sudden in a week, there was no Soviet ruble anymore. There was no currency. And there was no government structure because it dissipated. But it was peaceful. And one of the major areas of this, I believe, was that they had food, so they didn't have to worry about that. The second was that they were generally optimistic that life would get better. So with that, all of a sudden, I started to get some information that things, let's say, weren't looking very good between NATO and Russia. And I decided to close down my corporations and come back and look at it. And I think I did a lot of information searching. I found another engineer, Dmitry Orlov, who wrote an excellent paper called 5 Stages of Collapse. I recommend people searching for it and read it, because we in America resemble that. When we look at the collapse of the Soviet Union and right before they collapsed in the United States now, there's a lot of similarities. So this really came back to a very, very simple thing of, I came back to the United States, and my family has a farm in New Jersey, and I decided to make it sustainable. And I had a huge amount of difficulty, and I couldn't figure this out. Now, I prospered and did very well in business on Soviet or former Soviet territory with the Latvians and the Russians, but I couldn't come back and make a sustainable farm when we already owned the farm. So I started to dig, and I found the complexities of it, and I said, "Oh my goodness!" And what arose was the vulnerability of our own supply chain and the problems that it caused.
Let me stop there for a second before we go down that road. I myself, not having any personal experience as yourself with this, with the Soviet Union, the collapse and all that, I thought that in a political sense, or ideologically political sense, we're in a similar situation where you had the Bolshevik Revolution and all this stuff going on in the beginning, or 1917, et cetera, which led to the Soviet Union, which was now has collapsed. It looks to me like in America, we're really kind of politically in that same position where you have the extreme left and the propaganda in the mainstream and whatnot, we're kind of like in our own version of that now. I say Soviet American style is how I kind of say. What do you think about that?
Well, I do. I do see a lot of that. I see that there's this battle going on in America. Recall, America is a union of states. So was the Soviet Union. It was a union of states, and so is the European Union. And so when I look at this and I see political battles going on in America at this moment over the structure of the union, and that's quite concerning. And but let's say my focus and expertise is more on the supply chain, and I look at this, I said, oh my goodness, our supply chain could collapse very easily. I mean, so I simply reverse engineering how many ways or what could cause the collapse of our supply chain.
I know the first clue I had was years ago there was a outbreak in Salmonella or something or other, and like all of the spinach or most of the spinach was unavailable. And I'm thinking, well, how does that? Did it jump between state to state to state? I mean, how does that happen? I mean, it really isn't a disease to carry on and so on. And that's when I realized that like there was 2 major farms in California that provided like all of the spinach for the rest of the United States. And I was like, holy cow, how did that happen?
Our structure now, as best as I can see, is that we're driven for investment from one basic rule: return on investment, and also that leads to economics of scale, where you can have a huge corporation, and because of transportation, because of taxation, because of a bunch of other things, it is more profitable to create one huge factory and distribute everything than have a balance of production. And so we've been lulled into this economics of scale. And yes, it probably makes the best rate of return, but it also leaves us at a very vulnerable position, such as let's call it continuity of life. Let's say all food comes from one location and then transportation breaks. Your rate of return isn't that important because you're not going to have food to eat. Yeah. And that's one of the basis, the foundation here is, we need pretty much 3 things. We need air, we need water, and we need food, right? The rest we can kind of solve. Well, if we don't get food, right, we're not going to get very far. We're not going to last. And so now we come back to that very simple situation is, well, for the first time in history, the history of the world that I can find out, is our food is on average 1,500 miles away. Well, when has this ever happened before? And that for us on the East Coast, it's 2,000 miles away. So if that transportation system collapses for any reason, we don't have food. And that's where it gets quite critical. Other things we can deal with, we can deal with if we don't have a new automobile, I can get the old one to work. If I don't have a new computer, I can get the old one to work. But if we don't have a constant supply of food, we're in deep trouble. And that's what's known as food security. And food security is a combination of food production, of which we're very good at. We have fairly good models of producing food, and accessibility, of which our just-in-time delivery system delivers it across the country in less than 3 days. But that's vulnerable to attack and collapse.
Which we have seen with the coronavirus and the reaction to it, how all this stuff kind of just rolled up in collapsed, and everyone's kind of like, what? Huh? Looking around.
Yeah, I look at first, there's a lot of emotion with the COVID-19. There's no doubt about it. So and there's a lot of expertise and a lot of information out there. I don't go into it, with the exception of saying, hey, this may save America. This was the one thing that has woken people up to the vulnerability of our supply chain. And I was reading an article, and I'll quote it. If the coronavirus has taught us anything, it's that supply chain essentials to life in America should not be outsourced or extensively complex and long. And there it is.
Yeah.
And that's truth. That is absolutely truth. So what do we do about it? And so that means, okay, let's come up with a plan. And how do we come up with a plan? And that's what I've been working on for a very long time, many years.
And you had the training going through the collapse and reorganization in Europe to have kind of a, hands-on learning along with your intellectual training to come here and get it ready here. Now, how do you think this is? Well, actually, I'm probably getting ahead of myself. I'm seeing here you have this phrase, which I meant to ask you on our talking, America Gray Swans. I don't know what that means.
Okay, yes. So there is a brilliant professor of economics, Nassim Taleb, who wrote a famous book in business called The Black Swan. And basically what he pointed out was that in our business plans, we have designed many possibilities. When we look at a business plan, we look into something called a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And in the threats part, we look at what could possibly disturb our business model and what are our solutions for it. So the bottom line with a black swan is that it wasn't a threat that we could even comprehend, and therefore it's not in our business model. And the black swan in the classic, the most well-known is the 9/11 attacks, which, if you were in business in New York, your business, some of those businesses just closed. It was a threat that we couldn't identify. That's a black swan. So it's basically an unpredictable event that is catastrophic to us. Mm-hmm. A gray swan, meaning a mixture between a white and a black, is a predictable event that is catastrophic. In other words, that we know that some of these events are coming, and they will be catastrophic in our position today. And there's so I just reversed engineer, and I said, what are the gray swans that could be catastrophic to our way of life in America, and what's their solution? What's their counter? If you study martial arts, if you study Aikido or Jiu-Jitsu, you'll know for every move there's a counter move. And so we know that there are these threats out there. They're being classically ignored. You can find information on them, but nobody's really taking massive actions about them in creating the counter or the protection from it. And so that was the American Gray Swans. And I identified about 13. There are more, but the 13 says, and proves that we are extremely vulnerable for our food supply to collapse, or our food delivery supply to collapse. And by the way, just after that, our food production will collapse, because when the just-in-time delivery system shuts down, then you have a delay time before the production of food also shuts down, such as farms not getting their seeds, not getting their diesel, not getting their repair parts. So you have, a couple of different stages here. The immediate one and the most most concerning is that the majority of America runs on 1 week of food, and that most of our supermarkets only carry about 1 week, and we've seen this in emergencies, and that if the country itself is affected, we simply run out of food delivery, and then within about 2 weeks, the majority of the country has no food. So the gray swans are the identification of events that could shut down our delivery system. And of course, as you are a master trucker, that you will identify these, that you can't deliver food if X or Y or Z happens.
Yeah, if I could, we did talk about this a little bit. So, but I don't want to. I think it'd be good to go over it again. Is the thing that I looked at, which is surprising to me, is, and I'm not looking at it as well as you're doing with all these different angles. I'm kind of looking at it straight on. I'm like, I don't understand this. You have producers who want to produce, whether it be a factory or a farm. They have products. You have consumers who want the products, and you have the infrastructure, trucks and so on, that want to deliver the product, and yet it's still shutting down. And it's like, I was just looking at it going, I don't understand that. And that's where I was talking to you about it earlier, and I think that would be good to kind of explain how is that possible when it apparently all three want to conduct business, and yet it still shuts down.
Well, my opinion is that all three want to conduct business, and that there's more than three parts in the chain, and that one of those parts, it's the same thing, is the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. Yeah. And so one of those parts in this particular case is where the let's say with the meat, the meat packing plants, that was the weak point in this particular chain of events. And so from the engineering side, if you look at something called a Gantt chart or a critical path chart, you'll see that you need all of those pieces of the chain to work in order to get the result. And now you only had one piece break, and the piece at the beginning and the piece at the end says, hey, we're in harmony, we want to do this, but the one in the middle stopped. And that's where the meat processing plants shut down because of a COVID-19, let's say, employee got sick. And so actually, if we just take that for a very quick second and we look at it, and I'm not arguing whether the strength of COVID-19 or how much of a pandemic it is, but let's say a chicken egg factory where you have 5 million chickens and they're laying 4.5 million eggs a day, and this services about 200,000 American families with a dozen eggs a week. And all you need for that entire system to stop is either one case of bird flu, which kills the chickens, or one case of, let's say, a pandemic like Ebola or as they claimed, COVID-19, and that stops the human side. And all of a sudden you have production stop. So if you look at our system, our just-in-time system goes through bottlenecks of economics of scale, where the production is so large and so efficient, but all you need is one wrench in the production system, and it stops. And that is where we're vulnerable. And so my opinion is that you have to create a fail-safe. You have to have other things in case in case the machine stops. And that was the focus. The first focus is that the gray swans point out how the wrench can get into the system and stop the system. For instance, if we have, let's say, well, the biggest and most concerning is an EMP that shuts down the electric grid. The farms stop, the production stops, the delivery stops, the retail stops, and if it stays stopped for more than 2 weeks, we have no food delivered.
Yeah, that would be the biggest one. In fact, there was a realistic scare on that with North Korea, who put out a low level satellite, which by design was not even a satellite. I mean, it looked like that's not even a satellite. What is it? Could it have been some type of EMP pulse? But when you're going back to this about the meats and whatnot, and the chicken example, it reminds me of someone who'd be investing in a portfolio and deciding to put all their money into one investment place, and then have that go down, and you're broke. And with our food system set up, for that matter, anything, electronics going from China, whatever, we're all set up so that all of the investment, let's say, of the production of this system is based in like one area, a vulnerable area. So
yes, I hate to say in the pun, but all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah. I mean, with the meat in particular, I've had experience where I've had to go to Oklahoma or Omaha to get beef, and I found out there were two gigantic beef slaughterhouses where literally the cows like went in one side, and then the beef comes out the other to go to the stores or what have you. And there were two of them within a mile of each other that were just gigantic in the same city. And
yes.
Then I've heard that there were basically four giant plants like this that take care of the country. Now there's smaller ones here and there, but if those go out, which in the case of it was happening with some of the meat processing where they were closing the plants, I mean that's huge percentage of it.
Yes, and that's an excellent example. And one of the challenges that I had when I came back from Eastern Europe is I've been blessed where I have some very close friends that are fraternity brothers for over 40 years, and they're at the top of different industries, at banking, at computers, of food distribution, and I'm there like going, hey guys, look at this, our food supply chain can collapse at any minute. And they literally would say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. This can never happen here. And just because it happened in Eastern Europe doesn't mean it's going to happen here. And but our entire system, our lives and our lifestyle depends on it. And so all of a sudden we get COVID-19 and everybody wakes up going, oh my God, our supply chains are vulnerable. Yeah, they are. They were before. Nobody did the math. Nobody did the physics to say it, or actually a small few did, but their voices were drowned out. And now we have it. And by the way, if it goes back to what it was before, it's still vulnerable. And it's not only vulnerable by nature. Let's say if COVID-19 was natural, but it's vulnerable from attack of our enemies, right? Military, it's very well known that the militaries around the world are playing with pandemic diseases. It's also very well known that a few of the bigger militaries have the ability to create an EMP. It's also very well known that there's battles going on over financial currencies. So why would we sit here in a totally unprotected situation? It's very, very simple to take down the United States. There's a wonderful book, I wouldn't call very informative book. Was written by Ted Koppel, who's one of the top investigative and journalists, called Lights Out. Just read that. We're just totally vulnerable for our supply chains to collapse. And so what are we doing about it? And this is me and you. What are we doing about it? We're bringing alert to it to awaken people to this and say there are solutions. Actually, some of the solutions are very simple. Very simple.
Now, in these solutions, I mean, it would take. I hate to use the word consensus, but it would take all of us to go like, yeah, we need to solve this and push it forward, because it's going to take effort. It's going to cost money. You have to change the way things are done. And for example, these big meat plants don't sound like they're going to go along with it, right? They're not going to, no, wait a minute, we like the way it is. And all the way down the line, you're going to have pushback from the current system or those benefited from it.
Well, you may have pushback from it, right? It depends on who are their controllers, who and what they focus on. For instance, I'm not saying get rid of economics of scale. I'm saying we have to have a balance so that we have a fail safe. If economics of scale fails, then we have local production that can pick up the ball and run with it until economics of scale gets back in. So it behooves the big corporations, who, if they really believed in long-term business, it behooves the big corporations to have fail safes and work with a balanced system.
Yeah, I think it seems like, we had talked on the phone about Matt Stein, who I've had on the show before. He put out a white paper about how simple it would be to protect the grid from EMP and how devastating it would be, decades to refix it if it hit. And the argument, as I looked into it, the argument seems to be the power companies want the government to pay for it, and the government wants the power companies to pay for it. End of discussion, and here we still are vulnerable.
I would say that's what the reported arguments were, and I would also say that when you dig deeper into the issues, you'll find more complexity. But at the same time, the bottom line is, if we get an EMP, those corporations are no longer in business, and the government is no longer in business. If we get a massive EMP, it's already been reported and verified that we can expect a 90% death rate in America. All right. So what are these people doing to protect us? And in some ways it's not my individual responsibility to protect the United States, although I do have part of it, or yours. So what are the corporations doing, arguing about this EMP stuff, right? Why can they, what is it that they need to do to come to consensus to put in some very simple yet high level technical surge protectors so that our transformers don't blow up? And when I look at it right now, it's an awful lot of BS and rhetoric. And honestly, I believe that we're getting pushed very close to a civil war. And these people who are leaving us vulnerable, well, they're going to be one of the first casualties.
Yeah.
It's that's my personal opinion. And I want them to know it. It's not like we're a bunch of idiots anymore. We're connecting. We know who's stopping this. We know which senators are blocking this. We know which states they're from. Right. And if it push comes to shove, unfortunately, it'll be very, very detrimental for the United States. But these people are going to pay a very dear price. That's my personal opinion.
It seems like, my experience when I worked at the Fannie Mae Candies, for example, the CEO didn't care about the company. He had his bonuses and whatnot. He ended up shutting down a company to save some money for he got his bonuses. So when the company fell apart, he just walked away. But there's a little difference in this case. It's not a company and you go to another one. It's the system. And so
I think it's more than the system. I think that in my opinion, that if the United States goes down, so does the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. We're the last bastion of freedom, if you want to call this freedom. And that if we go down, then the majority of the world goes into chaos. Not that I did. I wanted to get to this point.
Right, right. We're kind of. I was just thinking about this. We're kind of in the food thing here. So
Yeah, right, right. Well, let's come back to one very simple thing. If we have food, we can solve virtually all problems. If we don't have food, we can't solve any of them. Right? And so let us focus on what does it take to create food security in the United States of America. Food security, meaning that we have excellent production and we have access to it under almost all difficult conditions. That's food security. And right now we don't. And one of my big issues is I can't find anybody responsible for this. You know, we can find somebody responsible for the Air Force. We can find somebody responsible for the nuclear plants. We can find, people responsible for the currency, although we shouldn't take that rabbit hole. But but who's in charge of making sure we have food security? And my guess is that there's not one individual, and so far, by default, in my opinion, it goes to the Joint Chiefs of Staff because their job is security of the country. I mean, it's the Department of Defense. I don't see us being defended. I see us wide open to get attacked. Right? So what does it take to wake up the Joint Chiefs to say, hey, there's more to defending the country than just military toys. And let me pick on the Joint Chiefs. I mean, this has been proven by Catherine Austin Fitts and a couple other people. The Department of Defense cannot explain where $23 trillion has disappeared. And at the same time, where you and I know that if we have a missing $10 Starbucks receipt on our IRS forms, they find it. So how can you lose $23 trillion? And that's not, it's almost like, listen, put some into food security so we have a country and we can get through whatever challenges we're going to have. So I'm picking on the Joint Chiefs. These guys are supposed to be defending us, right? You can't create a food grid, a secure food grid. Come on, there's like 15 books on the subject, right? So and of course at the bottom, theoretically, the buck stops at the President of the United States, and whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump, I don't get into the political arguments, whether it's Republican or Democrat. He's the person in charge of that position, and he's the one that can influence the United States. He's the direct one. Unfortunately, I lost an awful lot of confidence with the Congress. These people are basically compromised. And any congressman who wants to challenge me on this, just come out and give us a permission to release, give permission to release the Wiener files and the Epstein files.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just tell me I'm full of it. Just give permission that if it's not on you, it's on your colleagues, and let's just release those files and see who was, how I say, Santa Claus says, making a list of, who's been naughty and nice, checking it twice. Yeah. So let's look at the Congress is insignificant in this matter. Right? It's the president. The president can change the entire investment sequence, which actually was the solution. Part of the solution is that our entire world runs on, in America, on ROI. Return on investment. Well, yeah, but what happens to continuity of life? Which is more important, continuity of life or return on investment? And that's directed directly, to the financial gurus in Wall Street. If there's no food, yeah, you might be rich enough to afford it, but the majority of the people of America aren't, and they're going to pick up their guns and they're going to blame you. I think we need to point this out. that we are in a very dangerous position, and the people who can change it are, one, the Joint Chiefs, the president, right? Sometimes the state governors, and the financial machine that we have. If it doesn't get changed, all I can say is, what flavor cake do you want to be served? Because it's coming. It's coming.
When you talked about return on investment and continuity of life, I thought of myself. I thought of the story of King Midas. Well, here he has a system where everything he touched turned to gold, which would be, great wealth and, everything like that, except when he tried to eat, it turned to gold. So he couldn't eat it. And it kind of reminds me here with the food aspect, referring to investment, rate of return and continuity of life.
Yes, it's a basis. And so what we need to do is create a system that inspires. Right now, we're at a fairly critical point where the 1% people who have money to invest need to invest it into local, regional, sustainable farms that are in control of the local community. So it can't be co-opted. It can't be, taken over. And that, if we did an 80-20 rule where 80% of our food comes from the system that's already in place and 20% comes from local producers, right? We can withstand almost any change. And history shows this. History shows, this is military strategy 101. Cut the supply lines. If you cut the supply lines, the army, marches on its stomach, it dies real quick. And so we're sitting here waiting for, a catastrophe, and we have the solutions to prepare for it, right? And actually, I listened to some of the military people. It's pre-positioned logistics. If we created food in every one of our states that's able to sustain local populations, we are incredibly strong. So why aren't we doing it? What's stopping us? I think the first part is just simply education. Yeah, and this is what you and I are doing. We're bringing education to the people. I have some friends that are very, very wealthy, and they're going, well, I don't get a rate of return on it. Oh, okay. Well, you're not going to have continuity of life if it happens. And please, another issue, don't expect your farmers to take the financial risk and create food security for you, for us, right? We don't expect Lockheed Martin to make the jets and the missiles for free. We expect them to make them, and we pay for them. Food security is a responsibility of all Americans. Right? Now, we don't have a system to do that. That's the problem. And so if our delivery system breaks down, please don't come to my farm. Right? I can feed my family. I can feed maybe a few of my friends, but the strangers are going to have a very difficult issue because most farmers are very much aware of this. Actually, this week, President Trump actually came out and said, you need your guns to protect your potatoes. Well, how many of us are actually growing potatoes? 1% of Americans are actually producing food. That means 99% aren't. And it's like, so the farmers have been reaching out saying, look, we need help. We want to protect it, but I can't do it myself. I can't take this financial risk. I can sit there and invest a couple $100,000 more in a farm, right? That doesn't give a rate of return so that you guys are protected with food. I can't do that. It's like asking you to supply all the trucks, even though, you have no financial ability to do it. Right? So this is where we're at right now. And we had this COVID-19 to wake up everybody that, yes, not only do you not have a supply of toilet paper, it's very close that you might not have a supply of food. And then what? Right. And of course, I'll take a pet peeve on this. So they have us divided and conquered. Well, we're not conquered yet. We're divided. where we're not allowed to go out of our house. We're not allowed to be within 6 feet of each other, which is ridiculous, because who made 6 feet versus 7 feet versus 8 feet? But, but, it's divide and conquer. We have to get together and we have to create a critical mass, and we have to create, this spontaneous movement to protect our own country.
Now,
sorry about this.
No. I mean, that's good. I mean, it would seem that when I look out at the energy and they have the windmills and all this stuff, the only reason why windmills make money is because it's subsidized on the manufacturer side, and it's subsidized on the person who buys it, and the power companies have to pay for the power generated, even though, as an aside, a lot of it doesn't even matter, because when you have nuclear generators, you can't turn them on and off. They're constantly going to be creating the power. When you bring in the wind power, it doesn't add anything to the mix, but I digress. The point is that if we had that kind of idea with food, where you can have tax credits investing in putting together sustainable food, local food, there's your incentive for people to invest.
That's absolutely correct. And I look at this issue every day, and there are probably 5 solutions or 6 solutions, and it really takes smarter guys than me to figure it out. And that as an example, if you look at corn ethanol, all right, the use of corn to create energy is terrible. We lose 90%, 99% of the energy just in the production of it. All right. So on just common sense, it's a really bad investment for energy. So why do we have multi-million dollars or $1 billion invested in corn ethanol? Because the United States government subsidizes it. So right there is the model where you can subsidize local sustainable farms through tax advantage. That's just one model. There's a bunch of them. It's not one solution. There's multiple solutions, but it's actually creating a team of brilliant people without, let's say, the greedy hands of the bankers in there to try and coordinate it to their buddies. But there are solutions. And if we don't create the solutions, it's just a matter of time. Honestly, do you think, I'm not going to pick battles with potential enemies, but let's say the Russians. Do you think that Putin's is not wise that he could take down our system immediately by just shutting down the supply chain? Or the Chinese, who clearly have come out and told us 90% of our materials for our pharmaceuticals are controlled by China. They told us this. So do you think that they won't use those as weapons to shut down our supply chains? Come on, it's not even that. It could be just an accident of nature. All we need is one burp from the sun, and you and I won't be communicating anymore. But we have the technology to protect against all of this. We do, but it's not being put into place. Why? We have a dysfunctional government. Hey, all you have to do is watch, CNN. You see the dysfunctional government from a biased side, but it's dysfunctional.
Let me take 1 second. Let me take 1 second, though. I notice you're going to come up people listening because there's some key words that that might trigger, and I want you to explain the difference between your use of the word sustainable, and the UN's use.
Well, the challenge there is that we're in a battle all over words. Also, the easiest one to look at is organic, because when now if you look at food that's stamped organic, it's not organic. Any top chef will tell you that it's a percentage organic. So again, the machine captivated the term. Well, the same with sustainability. There's a battle going on. The United Nations wants to create sustainability. Well, there's, I'm actually searching for words that are better and replaceable, so that the machine, the global machine, doesn't try to captivate it. What I meant by sustainability is that it's in harmony with the earth, that it's energy self-reliant, that it doesn't create damage to the earth, that it can be financially strong, so that it can withstand a financial debacle, right? That form, and that it's a viable farm, that it's locally controlled, right? And so it's actually, we're in a battle on terminology on a bunch of things. And listen, I'm just one guy. But by the way, there's a whole army of ragtag farmers, truckers, scientists out there battling this along with me and you, saying, look, as soon as we get some form of some form of catalyst, this thing will take off. It's not just me. It's just that I happen to have more experience with the collapse of a supply chain than anybody else did.
Yeah, I look at the sustainability in terms of a house withstanding a storm, that kind of aspect where you're able to put up together, in this case, a farm that could handle several different stresses and still be able to not only maintain food but existence. So when you put a financial stress on it, it can hold it because it has infrastructure put in place. If you put a particular weather stress on it, there's ways to continue to be viable. So to me, like, when it's sustainable, means the ability to be viable under stress, whether by removing the stress or by infrastructurally building it to withstand the stress.
I agree totally. And what happens is we haven't defined a term for it. It's almost like, again, I mentioned Aikido, where you, or jujitsu, where you use the opponent's energy against them, which apparently Putin's quite good at. So we know that somebody's trying to capture the phrase sustainable and make it, into their little hierarchy, but it's more like harmony, renewable, viable, 21st century farming, flourishing, integrity, alternative, all of those things mixed into that your farm can grow and prosper and add value to the earth and to the people. And so that's a definition of a term, of which is coming. But let's jump back to it. We have the technology to do this. We have the technology. We have weather changes coming. There's no doubt about it. That the weather patterns are changing, and that will disrupt world food production. This is exactly what we're seeing. And I think I had mentioned in a past interview, you want to have a good amount of food grown, in greenhouses and hail proof. And in the last 2 weeks, we saw melon-sized hail come, streaming through somebody's roof. So these changes are happening, and so we have to, kind of have a lot of common sense about this. And if, listen, anybody who argues for any reason that you should, it's not good to have a certain amount of healthy food production within a population center, these are clearly people against humanity. These are controllers. This is the swamp, in this regard. And, as far as the UN, I'm not very happy with the UN, and that they've been trying to control worldwide use of water and energy. Well, what are the two things you need for growing food? Water and energy. and of course, they blame it on, how big our car engines are, but there's very little science to support that. This is just one more hierarchy trying to control water and energy and take freedom out of the hands of the people by controlling their food. We come back to Henry Kissinger: control oil, you control nations; control food, you control the people. Well, they're losing control of oil, which is a good amount of the battle in the Middle East. And of course, when Tesla technology pops out, they've lost control of energy. So they're trying to get control of water and food. What part of this, isn't very clear?
One of the stories I heard that was ridiculous, and it backfired because the population begged, but I forgot what country it was. I think it was South America. They made it illegal for you to collect rainwater, that the company a private company who was taking charge of the water in this country said you had to buy it from them, and that they owned the rights to the rainwater for drinking and so on.
I don't know how far south you have to go. You could try Oregon and Colorado. It's like, that it's illegal for you to collect rainwater. You go, excuse me? Right? But if we go back to, all roads lead to Rome, they say. There's a certain amount of truth. If we go back to the Roman Empire, I was in Austria one time, and I came across this incredible, charming, tiny little city, and they claim to be the oldest municipality in Austria. And I go, why is that? Oh, well, when the Romans came through, they found the salt mine, and they controlled it. And I go, well, okay, why? It's very simple. Because in those days, 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, right, food preservation, the majority of it was done with salt. So if you controlled salt, you controlled food. And this came back, this is the same thing with Gandhi's March to the Sea. The British Empire, not pointing any fingers at the Queen, right, but the British Empire put a tax on salt, even though the average Indian could just go to the sea, get a bucket of water, let it dehydrate, and have minerals to preserve their food. But that was illegal to do. It's all, control food, control the people. It's all there. So what do we have right now? We have a system created, whether, deliberately or not, where the food is controlled. Processed food is controlled by 9 corporations. And you just saw a bunch of them close down their meat processing plant. We saw that. I mean, this is history now. And so how do you get the control out of some corporations? Well, that's simple. You have investment into, alternative sustainable farms in local control. And so there's the battle. That's the big picture.
So the control aspect means that people would invest in the farm and they would get a return on investment, but the farm would decisions and all that would be made by the farmers, not by some desk person controlling the money.
Well, there is one of the challenges of creating a model that works. Okay, so for instance, now I don't support McDonald's quality of food. Although I do like the way it tastes, but in fairness, but if you look at McDonald's will be able to take a product and get it consistently produced throughout the world. So if you actually look at it, what they've done is they've systemized everything. I think Michael Gerber in The Entrepreneurial Myth had pretty much outlined it. And so take a lot of the pressure off of the farmer, a lot of the monkeys off the back. Right now, you're saying to your farmer, you have to understand nature. You have to take the financial risk. And now we see some of our farmers getting beaten, where the government comes in and say, you have to cull your herd, right? They have to know marketing. They have to be able to sell these things. right? They have to have accounting background because, some of these are multi-million-dollar investments, so they have to be able to run this, right? And they have to know veterinarian to a degree, and so the amount of load of knowledge that you put on your farmer. And another thing, according to Jim Rogers, the billionaire, he says that the average age of an American farmer is 65. Well, listen, I think you and I aren't spring chickens. After a certain amount of time, those farmers are going to retire. Who has the knowledge base to grow our food? What, our young? Is it on the smartphone? It's like I have daily battles with my goats. It's like they're constantly escaping. So, and the same with chickens. So where is this knowledge base going to come from to create food? And what do we see the UN doing today? Proposing that we eat bugs. Excuse me? We eat bugs? Well, how about if we let the UN eat bugs? And so this is the battle going on, and so our farmers are under threat, and so are our truckers who are delivering the stuff, and you know that better than I do, right? Those two combinations are food security, right? And now we have the processors. So the part of the answer is to diversify your processing. Put in a certain percentage of mini processing plants. Well, who controls that? The FDA. Again, who controls the FDA? Oh, we won't name their names, right? But, where's the transparency here? So this is the battle that's being formed. It is a battle. It's a battle that we have the freedom to grow our own food. All right, now we have to change some of the aspects of it. And one of them is rate of return. I joke. Somebody says, I talked to some wealthy investors. I said, well, lend me $5 million. I will give you a whopping return of 1%. Well, that's because the other investments are being subsidized by the United States government. So this is I'll call it a dilemma, the dilemma we're in. And at this particular time, I think we have enough white hats that are starting to wake up. I won't name any of them, but a bunch of white hats saying, yes, this is right. We have to have a certain amount of our food locally produced for all of our population centers. That's it. And it's very easy to do, by the way. And there are many different ways to do it. For instance, you don't have to put in a farm, but you can take empty shopping malls and turn them into hydroponics or aquaponics. What was it?
Yeah, they're closing down. I mean, even before this COVID stuff, they're closing down. So,
agreed. And so, one of my greatest challenges in Eastern Europe was to take a Soviet building and turn it into a Western value of production of some sort. My first one was I took Soviet apartments and I turned them into Western level apartments. And then I took a Soviet building and I turned it into Western quality and actually create, I was the landlord for the American ambassador. I had to create and build his residence. And the same with the European Commission. So it's actually the foundation of almost all real estate is change of use changes value. So now what we're doing is we're looking at how do we take farms and change them into EMP-proof, viable, let's say sustainable farming in harmony with the earth. Right? That's just a real estate project. It's very simple to do. But what's the rate of return? And it's not a rate of return that's driving it. It's actually a continuity of life. I'm just an hour outside of New York. There's a whole bunch of billionaires that are going to starve to death, right? If New York, and as a trucker, you would know, if New York gets shut off, what is it? New York takes 400 million tons of cargo a year, 90% delivered by trucks. Okay, all you have to do is shut down trucking, and New York lasts 1 week. 1 week, that's it. So all of these billionaires have all that investment in New York, that goes to zero as soon as the functionality of New York drops. Of course, you got, Governor Cuomo sending the elderly into a COVID-19 factory. And any conflict of interest there? What's wrong with these people? Why can't they see it? If we don't have food, we're not going anywhere.
Well, you mentioned about Joint Chiefs and all that. I was just thinking now that if you look at our defense system, the president talked about how they rebuilt the defenses. They spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. Well, those actual defenses don't yield, forgive the pun, fruit. They're there in case there's a war. Perhaps they're there to prevent, as a preventative, like, here I'll prove to you I have this, so you'll leave me alone. But if you could look at food in the same context of creating this type of a system for the local food as a defensive weapon for in case something will happen, and it will, whether it be a storm or whatever. I mean, these events will happen. You could look at it in terms of a preventative, reoccurring, but preventative infrastructure.
Absolutely. And kind of what along the lines of what you're discussing is that, we spend trillions on defense. Well, what's the rate of return?
Yeah.
Well, besides the corporation, but for the people who are paying it, what's the rate of return? Well, it's zero. Why? Because it's defending us. Right. And so you look at it this way. Let's say, we have a multi-billionaire and he has this, $100 million yacht and all that, and he has a lifeboat, and the lifeboat costs $100,000 because it's related to the size of the yacht. And you go, okay, what's your rate of return on your lifeboat? If your ship goes down, what's your bailout situation? A lifeboat, what's your rate of return on that investment? Well, it's zero. It's protecting my life. Yes, continuity of life. That's it. Mm. That's absolutely the issue. And so all of a sudden you have it being controlled by the FDA on prices that we're allowed to sell food to. So the farmers, especially in the East, aren't producing as much food as they can because they're being blocked by administrative barriers created by the FDA and the EPA and a few others, the IRS. I mean, we can go right down the line. But you're not allowing what's called a food grid or food security, right, to be created. And that gets back right to the Council of Foreign Relations and Kissinger. Control food, you control the people. Food is in control of 10 corporations. Right? And now we see somebody manipulated it and closed down the processing meat plants. That's it. And, hey, you just have to look at who the board of directors are, get their names. Someplace out there, somebody's smart enough to make a list. And someplace out there, and I really hope somebody figures this out, that what do we call them? The sheepdogs are starting to take notice because the wolves are cornering the sheep. Right. And as soon as it goes, as soon as the situation goes chaos, all right, let's do it. Right? I think people are naive to think that the farmers aren't aware of this and they aren't preparing for it. Right? What are you going to do? 1% of your population produces food for the other 99, and they're telling you that we're in trouble. We're telling you anywhere from the weather situations are changing, the distribution systems are changing, that the financial situation is changing. There are some reports that the suicide rate with farmers is double that of veterans, and the suicide rate with veterans is unacceptable. How dare we not protect our own people that protected us? I mean, this is just, I don't even have words for it. This is a system and of a corrupt, as they call it, the swamp. Mm. Right? And this is all coming to a head at this time. And so in some ways, we must take action, and we must focus on this, and we must get the part that's on the side of humanity to wake up and take action. And part of that's financial. We've got to get these guys in the banking situation to start funding local development, food development.
I'm thinking that just looking at it, that using the aspect of defense would be the at least bottom way to do this. I mean, there's more, but I mean, you have to eat. So when you're spending all this money on defense, you can it would be a modest investment on these farms by comparison to the trillions being spent on war.
Yeah, my simple thing is that, I had to deal with a lot of different governments, and it was very interesting. It's like, I don't want to go down those rabbit holes ever again. But one of the things is, don't go after the defense budget. Leave the defense budget there. Just simply say to the defense people, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, recommend that food security is a national security issue to the president. And all he has to do, the president, is sign one executive order giving a massive tax advantage to anybody who puts in investment into qualified, that has to have certain abilities, qualified, EMP-proof, sustainable, locally owned farm, and you will see trillions of dollars go into local farms.
Yeah, you need the qualified in there because as we've seen now with the helping people through this layoffs, the big corporations that got money through this where they shouldn't have, everything from Harvard to Planned Parenthood, you you do have to be specific because the cheaters and wolves will come running.
Of course, look, we're all human. We've been through this. History has shown we've been through this numerous, in different ways, numerous times. You just can't simply give money away without some form of transparency and control. So qualified by, you have to have a certain amount of alternative energy. You have to have a certain amount of storage of energy. You have to produce a certain amount of product. You have to have a certain amount of square meters, or I'm sorry, I think it's square meters, square feet under greenhouse, let's say. Yeah, and these are all easy to set and say, yeah, okay, and then you'd be able to get a let's say a 20% tax write-off for 5 years. I mean, you would see a huge amount of money. Now, that's just one possibility using tax law, because we've seen it used before. But there are a bunch of other ones. And you get, listen, we got some very smart people out there. We're just not allowed to put this whole thing together. Like Catherine Austin Fitts or Martin Armstrong or Joel Salatin, or, it's like, we have all the solutions. We just have to bring it all together, and we have to force that our government does this. Right? We have to sit there and when a governor goes, no, I'm sorry, you can't buy seats, you throw them out. Yeah, it's like going, okay, here's the unemployment line. Welcome to it. And that's it. Where are the American moms? Where are the moms that are not standing up to defend their own children? 25% of our people look like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. They're obese. Where do you think this came from? It comes from the food supply, right? Where are the moms defending their own children? Why are they not angry as hell? Why are they not, going down and ripping the heads off of different politicians who are just ignoring this? Come on, where are they?
I had a friend, short-term acquaintance that came from Bulgaria, and he was talking about when Bulgaria first became democratic elections and all that they were in a lot of trouble. The people were upset. There were unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. So the people went down to the Capitol and pulled out the Congress, whatever it would be called, out in public and beat them. And they resigned, and they had re-elections. And I said, what about the police? I said, they were people too. They were, so they took them out, and then they all resigned, and they had elections again. And I'm thinking, like, boy, we need a little touch of that. I mean, not necessarily going to beat him up, but that kind of that irate, wait a minute, you guys are supposed to be helping here, and you're hurting, that type of.
Well, I think it's what was it? I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Well, a wonderful case study to look at is what happened in Iceland. Okay, because I had dealings with Iceland, and we knew, my partners and I knew that the Icelandic krona was going to collapse like a year before it does. Now, by the way, I knew I've been through 5 banking crises, and I knew it 2 weeks before they were going to happen. That many of these things are somewhat planned or you're aware of them. So anyway, what happened in Iceland was very interesting. There are only 350,000 people or so, maybe 375 in Iceland, and their krona was used for the I forgot the actual term, financial. It was a financial swap that the world was using, and it was extremely overvalued, and what happened was it collapsed.
Okay.
And so the party the party in power said, okay, well, we're going to bail out the bankers, right, for all the bad loans. And so the Icelandics threw them out, and they brought in the other party, whether it was right to left or left to right, I'm not really sure. And the other party goes, oh yeah, well, and you know what the other party did? They sat there and they tried to pass a law to revalue all of the loans that you made into current exchange, so that there was a massive hyperinflation, and they tried to put in a law that took the hyperinflation and recreated it so that the bankers would be paid back. And so the Icelandic people threw them out. So they threw out the left and they threw out the right, and they finally came to a very simple decision that the bankers were buying all of the politicians, and there wasn't any way around this. So what they ended up doing was, if you wanted to be in the parliament of Iceland, you just threw in your name, and we'll pick it out of a hat. So they bypassed the bribery of all of the bankers, and that parliament came and actually did incredible things for Iceland. And very interestingly is that Britain tried to pass a law to arrest anybody from Iceland that came through, because they were so mad because their bankers were being repaid. And of course, all roads lead to to Rome, but probably through the city of London bankers.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, I was watching that a little bit from afar, and they ended up charging and imprisoning, finding guilty some of the bankers for.
Yeah, they did. The new parliament. Yes, that's true.
And they were chastised by the Western banking and whatnot, and they were said, too bad. And the Iceland disappeared from the map because Iceland took on the world money situation and told them to go pound sand, and they're still there. They're still working.
And they're doing really well. They're recreating their financial structure after the arbitrage. The Icelandic krona was used for arbitrage. In other words, the parasites of the banking world set up Iceland to exploit it. Okay, so all right, this is the world we're in right now, and then we come back to I come back to one focus. With food, we can solve almost all problems. Without it, we can't solve any. And right now, if our system drops, if for any reason our supply chains drop, our food drops. And so that's for the Americans to wake up and say, we're not going to take this anymore. You either create financial systems to create local, a certain percentage of locally produced food, or something else happens, right? And I think we're coming up to that.
Yeah, I think it's almost like there's a calm. It's like, okay, you got a little taste. You saw what could happen. Now what are you going to do about it? Nothing? Okay.
Well, here's kind of like, I really like the 80-20 rule. I like Fibonacci numbers and looking at nature. So the 80-20 rule was 80% of the Americans woke up. There's no argument. Our supply chains are extremely vulnerable. And let's not go back to sleep. Let's take action on it now. Because, I hear some people who are quite daft and say, well, I just want it to go back to normal. It's not going back. It's not even coming close to back. It's totally vulnerable. And if we don't correct it, it's just a matter of time, which is one of those things that I wanted to point out. Of the 13 gray swans, something like 5 of them are guaranteed to happen. If they happen in our present positioning, that's it. It's over.
Why don't we list these 13?
Well, I'll just run down real quick.
Okay.
You have EMPs from a solar. Okay. Last I checked, the United States government, nor the military-industrial complex, nor anybody else controls the sun. Last I checked. Not sure. I could be updated on my science, but if the sun is going into a minimum. Now, it's not going to happen quickly. It looks like, as best as I can tell, it could be 10 to 20 to 30 years away. But if it goes into that minimum, we have a mini ice age. That means basically all food production on the globe changes, right? Why? We must be proactive in this, all right? But during those times, you can get a massive EMP from the sun, meaning a coronal mass ejection. All right, that's been proven. We had one back, I think, in 2013. Fortunately, it's facing Mars, and it didn't head our way. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this conversation. Right. Other ones are nuclear. Well, that's not a nuclear holocaust. That's firing off one or two. Right? That can happen. Right? And if it does, again, we go back to the 1850s without the infrastructure of 1850. Right. We also have EMP technology. The Russians have admitted it. All you have to do is look at the USS Donald Cook, and the Russians flew over and tested and turned off one of our Aegis class destroyers in the middle of the Black Sea. It was a floating duck, and quite embarrassing. Well, the U.S. military, the U.S. Air Force has come out and said yes, they have the technology also, and demonstrated it. Okay. The Chinese, well, it seems they just turned off a couple of our military, some of our ships, but didn't admit to it. That was when all of a sudden one of our destroyers got ran down by a container ship. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, that's like getting run down by a steamroller. How could they not see it coming?
Yeah.
Right. Come on, and so we know that they all have the technology, right? I don't think that we'll ever have, and I hope it never happens, a nuclear holocaust. We'll have an electronic holocaust. We have that technology, right? A physical attack on the electric grid. If you look into the situation with what was the name of it? It'll come to me in a second. But there's a substation out in California that somebody showed up late at night and proceeded to shoot out all the holes in the oil cooling tanks. And and all of a sudden disappeared. And that ended up costing about $20 million to replace them. They took out 17 transformers, but they let it continue to work. They didn't take them all out. And if they did take them all out, Silicon Valley would have shut down for an estimated 6 months. Okay? And I mean, and the FBI doesn't know who did it. They just reported it. So it's very, there are 9 key substations. It's very easy to just shoot out the oil tanks, just like shooting out a car radiator. And it's not that challenging. This is all written up in Ted Koppel's book, Lights Out. Right? A cyber attack, we all know. You'll never be able to protect totally against cyber attacks. And when they happen, things shut down. And in our advanced world, our electric grids are all controlled by computers. Our electric production, our communication, our banking. If we get a really total cyber attack, it can all shut down. Of course, World War III is when, the big powers go to war. And, most people don't study war, but if you study war, they come at you with a blitzkrieg of all combinations. They go after your currency, they go after your electricity, they go after your water infrastructure, they go after your military. And so if we get to that point, it doesn't have to be nuclear. It's very simple to turn off the United States. One of the biggest concerns is I have is any of these start to happen, you get different dominoes falling. Well, one is a credit collapse. You're in shipping, you're in trucking, that the entire system works on credit. You don't carry $10,000 to pay for your gasoline. You have to use credit cards. You show up at the seller's end and say, okay, here's $100,000 for a container of beef, and I'll deliver it. Well, this did happen in Eastern Europe when the systems went down. Right? You had to pay in cash for containers coming over the border from Russia. Right? They don't discuss it, but that had to happen. And so right now they're trying to get rid of cash. So exactly how is anybody going to pay for a container if there's not if there's not a letter of credit? How's it going to happen? Are you really think the guys out in Wyoming, those very crafty, wise ranchers are going to trust very famous New York brokers with $100,000 worth of beef? It's just not going to happen. And of course, the pandemic. And I wrote on a pandemic in October. And I said, a real pandemic, something that takes 20 or 30% of the population out, people aren't going to move. If New York was infected and 30% of the people were dying right in the street, are you really going to drive in there and deliver food? I don't think so. Are the bankers going to go to work and keep the machine working? I don't think so. Right? I actually, in Latvia, I actually had a very contagious disease show up at one of the most, largest projects we had. It shut us down immediately. Unfortunately, it didn't get to us, fortunately, but I've actually had this experience. It's a total shutdown. Imagine coming to say to four ambassadors, I had to call them, they were my customers, and say, I'm sorry, sir, we may have had a contagious disease, and if it spreads, unfortunately, most of us will be dead in 3 days. It was like, okay, right? That's not in the MBA handbook, right? So now you have interviewed Professor McCanney. This guy's brilliant. He has energy solutions that we're not implementing. And so one of the things, I had a conversation with him. If we look across, as a geologist, if we look across the sea, we'll see that there's the Canary Islands, which are volcanic islands, and sitting right there is one of them called El Hierro. And El Hierro, if I pronounce it correctly, right, is an extinct volcanic cone. And if that collapses into the western part, it sends basically a tsunami that takes out the entire east coast of the United States. All right. Well, the geologists have proved this. Now, that can be triggered by Mother Nature, or it could be triggered by one of our enemies without anybody knowing it. All they have to do is bomb it. I mean, these are physical things.
Yeah,
so why
there's another one in the west facing in toward California, an island, that if the side of the mountain looks like the side has moved, if it slides down into the ocean, it could send a tsunami down the coast too.
Yes. Now, if you look at different parts, like for instance, I don't want to pick on California too much, but if the big one happens in California, that doesn't destroy our food and our distribution system. But if the big one happens on the east and it takes out New York and takes out our financial capital, that destroys our ability to pay for food. Right? So look at the combinations. And of course, on earthquakes, if the New Madrid happens, which is the largest recorded earthquake in American history, it basically radiates right up the Mississippi River, approximately. Well, that just severs all the bridges and the energy lines, and the food's on the west, and 170 million people are on the east. So again, we hit supply. So why aren't we diversifying our food supply? Now I'm not saying, get rid of all the farms out west. I'm saying do a balance, do a balance so that if we have a period of chaos, and actually that's what happens. If you look, like when 9/11 happened, we had a period of chaos. We had a shutdown. How long can you get through the period of chaos with the resources that you have? That's the key. And so for instance, if we had one of these events happen, we need to be able to get through that period of chaos until we can reestablish temporary supply chains. This is just common military science. So of course, and now we see the satellites, and NASA came out, and said very clearly, we need a space command so we could protect our satellites, because if our GPS system goes down, basically everything stops. And of course, not many people know it, but apparently all telecommunications and our electric grids and money transfers are all linked to GPS. So now the Chinese have the ability to do that, and so do the Russians. And so there's a blip from the sun. So why do we leave ourselves in this position that if it does happen, right, which is, some of these are guaranteed. It's guaranteed that we're going to have a New Madrid earthquake. We just simply don't know when. Could be tomorrow, could be 50 years, could be 100 years. It's overdue. Same with a solar EMP. It's guaranteed. And it's overdue. But we don't know when it's going to come.
Yeah, they had one in the early 1900s. I'm not sure if the date, 907, 908 or something, where they burned down the newly put up telegraph wires were the only thing in the sky. No satellites, no nothing, no power grid, just the telephone wires or telegraph wires, and they burnt down and just fell to the ground.
Yeah, the most famous was the Carrington event. It was 1859, and it was just a massive series of CMEs that literally created electricity in anything long and metal, which were the telegraph wires at that time, and also the train tracks, right? But they also had, there was local CMEs that affected only certain areas. I think it was Toronto, something 1989 that caused the Toronto blackout. So yes, we have these vulnerabilities. The issue is, what do we have for fail safes to get us through periods of chaos, right? And so we have this, and I mean, it's very evident that the only solution is to create what's known as a food grid or food security, whereas you have a percentage of your food produced locally and protected. That's it. And that's where we're focusing on. And it's not very expensive. Well, the Federal Reserve just put over $7 trillion on their balance sheet. And the US government just pumped in $3 trillion, for this COVID-19. So why can't we put like 500 billion into farming so we make sure we have food? I like food. I don't know about you. I like food. And I like the ability to have it. It doesn't have to be chicken.
I like that phrase, food grid. I like that. I think that's visually as well as definitionally a very good phrase.
Right. It is. It's a food grid. So let us harden our food grid. Let us also harden our electric grid. By the way, President Trump just signed an executive order to start hardening the grid. My understanding is it might take up to 10 years, but I'm not in that loop. But still, even if we hardened our electric grid, that does not mean we're not vulnerable. It means that we have some form of protection. We basically, in a nutshell, we do not have any physical insurance policies on food. And that's the one thing we need. Right? With food, we can solve virtually all problems. Without it, we can't. And if you look at military history, it's been used. It was used against Napoleon. It was used against Eisenhower. The Battle of the Bulge was because the Allies overextended and the Nazis cut it off and cut off their supplies. Right? Napoleon went into Moscow thinking that the Russians, the Tsar, would capitulate. He didn't know Russians; they don't capitulate, right? And what the Russian Tsar do? He burnt all the fields and food around Moscow so Napoleon could starve and sit in the winter. And finally, Napoleon had to evacuate, but by that time his army was devastated. Right? I mean, these are just massive amounts of history. So who thinks that it won't happen here? Well, COVID-19 woke us up. It's here. It can happen very, very easily.
No, right? I wanted to mention, you mentioned insurance. It just dawned on me that virtually all insurable situations can be recompensed by money. I mean, say like if the grid goes down, it's going to cost a lot of money to fix it, right? But you're alive while you're underneath there, but you need food. So there is no insurance against food other than food. You can't have money and no food, so the insurance system for food is food.
Our concept of insurance is that it's a financial emergency system. Okay. In other words, the FDIC says, okay, your accounts are guaranteed. We'll be able to pay you money for it. Right. If your house burns down, we pay you money for it. Right. What happens is if you look at it, all insurance is money guarantees, and we don't. The bottom line is we need physical guarantees on food, not money guarantees on food. What happens if money dissipates? What happens if the United States dollar turns into zero? Then all insurance goes, and that actually almost happened in the AIG collapse. It came very close to that. If you actually know anybody who's been in the meeting, we won't name any names or anything or discuss anything, but I had friends in there. And they said it came very close to all insurance basically collapsing because AIG was going down. Right? And action was taken. It was propped up. That was 2008. Now we're another 12 years. So financial is vulnerable. We don't eat money. We need food to live. So why is it that we're not creating physical food insurance? Everything else we can get by with. I don't need a new pickup truck, nothing personal against Ford or Chevy. I don't need a new computer, nothing personal against those guys or HP or, or IBM or any of those, right? We can get by with those in a period of chaos. We cannot get by in a period of chaos without food.
I remember the company I worked for, Fannie Mae Candies, they had a meeting one day, and they just dawned on them. I don't know if somebody told them or what, but they had all their frozen candy in one storage facility that was sold during Christmas time and Valentine's Day. You know, they work all year to make this candy up ahead of time, and they flash freeze it. Well, they realized they had it all in one place. And I remember talking to someone. They said, "Well, they're insured, isn't it?" He says, "Yeah, it's insured, but there's be no product for a year for the customers," which would, of course, allow the opportunity for someone else to do it or what have you. I mean, we have to be able to provide this stuff for the customers. You can't just have the money. And it's kind of the way I look at this food thing here, is that you can compensate somebody for their crop or whatever, but if everyone loses the crop, even if everybody can get paid, which they couldn't, there'd be no food.
That's correct. One of the things that not many people know about, which I experienced, was the collapse of the Soviet Union happened in November 1991. Okay. November, and especially for a good part of the Soviet Union, the harvest was already in. You bring in your harvest in October. So all of their food was already brought in and stored for the winter. And then the system collapsed. And then you had 15 individual countries. They didn't have to worry about getting the harvest immediately because it was already stored. So it gave them time to get to the next harvest, which was, starting 6 months away, where they would have to plant. So they had time to plan, time to react, right? Whereas if you had the collapse, like say in March, or where we started with this COVID, what happens if our farmers don't get their seed into the ground? We're not going to have a harvest. If you don't have the planting, you're not going to have the harvest. And that's one of the big issues, is when a collapse happens in the seasons of growing is critically important. There's another issue that nobody's really talking about. It's called, just-in-time inventory, where your rate of return on any investment is how much profit you make divided by your total investment. Well, because of just-in-time inventory, we don't have to invest a large amount in inventories anymore, because it can get delivered in 2 days when we need it. So therefore, if you lower the amount of your investment, your rate of return goes up. And so that's what our bean counters have been using to tweak all of the business models. So what that basically means is we don't have reserves for if the system breaks. We've been counting on it being delivered just in time. And that includes, now we get to niche businesses where you don't have the farms that grow corn making their own seed corn. They now buy it from a third company, and that has to be delivered. So the entire system is, if the corn seed doesn't get delivered, the farmers that are planting corn can't plant. And so this is a complex system of deliveries, of links in the chain. And if that breaks in a big way, our production of food goes down, our delivery of energy goes down, and of course our delivery of food goes down. And now those are what we need to exist.
Yeah, it doesn't. I tell you, between me and you and the people listening, I have a real bad feeling about this coming winter, because you have the election coming, you have all of this stuff coming, you see unrest, all the things you're talking about. I'm not even talking about like the solar, the sun, or nothing like that. Just the unrest that's going on here, and you're talking about how Russia collapsed just after the harvest and all that. But when you live in the north, which of course Russia is, people in the south don't realize that in the winter you die if you don't have heat. You die. You don't just get discomforted. You die. And so I really got a bad. I don't know. Maybe I hope I'm just.
Well, I would say a little bit of there is somewhat of experience on that. For instance, this whole issue going on with the Ukraine, I was watching from over there, and finally, basically, the Ukrainians they don't tell us this. First, mainstream media is lying. A good part of the government is lying on really what's happening over there. So the only pipeline going from the Soviet Union from the gas wells out east and like Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and all the stands went right through Ukraine. And now Ukraine, and then that went to Western Europe. And Ukraine now became an independent country, and they had the pipeline. So Russia now controlled the gas. And so they came to an agreement. And the Ukrainians were able to buy gas at underworld market price, but the Ukrainians, being former Soviets, were stealing about 15% of it. And of course, the Russians, being former Soviets, knew this and were quite pissed at them, upset. And so they kept on saying, look, one is you're not paying for the gas that you legitimately use, and you're not paying for the gas that you're stealing. And of course, this is half of the natural gas supply to Western Europe. So, and the Russians kept on saying, if you don't do this, if you don't pay, we're going to turn off. If you don't pay, and so this went on a couple of years. And finally, in the middle of the winter, the Russians turned off the gas. And the Western Europeans all had to change their underwear that day, right? Because half of their natural gas supply was turned off in the middle of the winter. But the crux of the story was poor Bulgaria had their line coming off of the Ukrainian line and got turned off totally. And my understanding was the Bulgarians had paid for their gas, but all the Bulgaria got turned off in the middle of the winter. And you had these babushkas who were in concrete, uninsulated Soviet apartment blocks that turned into refrigerators.
Mm.
They survived. They had to carry water 9 flights of stairs, because everything froze, but they survived. I think if we get turned off of energy, most of us will do okay. We'll figure it out. The issue is we need food. We always need food. You can get by, without heat for a while, or you can figure it out, but you need food, right? And so if we actually look at the whole thing, and of course, our production of food is very, very linked to diesel. Right? We need diesel to produce the food that we have.
Yeah.
Right. So in some ways, I wouldn't, I don't let all of it, because we have world experience. But at the same time, we also have world experience where, for instance, Stalin went in, shot all the farmers in Ukraine, and confiscated all the food and created a famine in the Ukraine, which is one reason why the Ukrainians are still mad at the Russians. Although it was Stalin, and Stalin was a Bolshevik, not, he was actually Georgian. But you killed millions of Ukrainians from starvation. Well, we're positioned for a famine if the system shuts down.
Yeah, I guess my point on that is, my daughter has a house with a fireplace, but I was looking at getting a little wood stove.
I would,
and I couldn't actually install it because of the building requirements.
Right.
You can't burn wood in my city or town, whatever. You can't burn wood. You can have, there's all these rules. I'm thinking, like, I wanted to get one anyway, and just have it handy. And I can, stick the exhaust out the window and board it up or something.
Well, as you know, it's very interesting dealing with former Soviet people because the majority of them are quite very good people, and they tell their experiences. And so what they actually said was nothing was allowed in the Soviet Union, but everything was possible.
I just got a text here. Probably going to wrap this up. There's some major thunderstorms coming in, and
Okay.
It might just actually lose the power anyway. So, if you want to kind of give us a wind up here, kind of a closing paragraph on our discussion.
Well, it's very simple. We have the technology to solve the problems. We have the finances to solve the problems. We don't have the political will to solve the problems, and we have to focus on that. If you personally, on an individual scale, if you are financially wealthy enough, you can invest into a farm yourself or a farm community. But to really solve the problem for the nation and for our communities, we have to get Washington to take action.
Yeah. And again, this COVID may be a bigger blessing than we realize. I mean, I don't know people died, but I'm saying in the scheme of things, it's kind of a shot across the bow. And it hit it hit a few people and caused some damage, but what's looming when the big guns come will make this look very small. I appreciate your sharing and your work, your discussion on this. And is there some way people can get in touch with you if they would like to? I haven't put any details up publicly yet, so tell them now, and then I'll put up in the description. Someone might get a hold of you.
Yes, first, all you have to do if you want to see some of my writings on the articles, you just search J.C. Cole, American Gray Swans, and that will pop up on one of the websites, a bunch of the articles, which explains our vulnerable position. I created a very simple web page, just simply so somebody can get in touch with me. What I'm actually looking for is that we get some of the financiers out of New York to fund a prototype, because if you fund the prototype farm, you can mass produce it very quickly. And so that's my search is to get to people who have wealth in New York that can fund the project.
Yeah, kind of like a prefab farm. You have it all planned out, whatever size it is, whatever buildings you need.
It's actually better than that. By the way, I had a prefab factory in Eastern Europe, and so I've been through this. What you really want to do is be able to take all existing farms and put in very quickly energy, sustainability, energy, hydroponics, and distribution, and we could get all of our farms in a very, very safe position very quickly. I estimate that it would take less than a year to get virtually 90% of all farms in America in a very stable position with finance. It's very simple to do. It's not high technology, and the farmers know that it's finance, and so we have to create the finance model. You can find a very simple web page. I'm one guy, so there's only so many limits I can do, or I'm limited on my actions. But you can find me at ahfarms.org. It's a very simple web page. American Heritage Farms, or AH Farms. And in closing, it's very simple. Our heritage, our American heritage, is based on farming. And if we want to continue to have a heritage, we better create a massive amount of farming. That's why it's called American Heritage, right? Everything, even going back to Thomas Jefferson, he believed in an agricultural community. And of course, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. And not in the control of a corporation, in the control. It's one thing that the corporations have to let go of is food control in the local areas. So that's my soapbox. Oh, yes. And God bless our warriors, our farmers, and our truckers. And God bless America. Just want to finish with that.
Amen. Amen. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time. And we will get this information up. And God bless you. And we'll talk some more.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All righty. We are out of time right now. We'll be back next week. Keep it fire. Hang in there.
Oh, my old friend, the one who walked before, the one who walk again, the ancient one of old, with wisdom for the new, revive our inner sight, retell your timeless truths. Oh, ancient one.
Feet to Fire is a production of IPS Media Works on the OnSync Radio network of stations.